a lot is that we see a lot more nowadays, right? Technology has changed such that we live in a globalized world where we see a lot more human suffering. We are aware of human suffering in a deeper, more immediate way than in the past, right? In the past, you walked by a river, you saw someone drowning, okay, right? How do you intervene? What are your responsibilities for intervening, right? But that's a local one-on-one situation. We now live in a world in which we see suffering all over the place. We see suffering that's not just local, but we see suffering around the globe. And there's a big challenge in how to translate these texts, how to translate these texts about my responsibility to the other to a setting where my seeing is a lot broader, okay? So that's this session's example of the broader topic that we're going to be addressing, which is how do we translate these texts? How do we translate these rabbinic texts that were written in very different times and places to our contemporary dilemmas, and yet see that they still have something, I think, many things that are very important to teach us. Okay, so that's kind of the broad framing, because I think that these are situations that we encounter all the time, and in some ways, as this example brings out, in more immediate ways, in more constant ways, right? It wasn't a daily occurrence, presumably, to walk by the river and see someone drowning, whereas now we turn on the TV and we see people suffering all over the place all the time, right? So in some ways, these texts become even more important because we have to engage with these issues on a more constant basis. That's the broad framing, okay? So I want to give a little bit more background today for the texts that we're going to be looking at. What are they? How did I pick them? Why did I pick them? So the texts we're looking at, I would say, are broadly Torah texts with a capital T, meaning they are the texts of the Jewish tradition from the Bible until today. And you'll actually see on the source sheets that I have given you texts, and the primary text that we're going to be looking at in the second section of the source sheet are contemporary responsa, contemporary questions from the 20th century that were asked of rabbinic authorities, in this case in Israel, and their responses to those questions. Okay, so that's the broad range of texts from the Bible, let's say sometime before the 3rd century BCE, right, various books of the Bible, until responsa that were written 20 years ago. And I put the dates, I translate the dates exactly so you see just how contemporary these questions are, okay? So what I want to actually do though, right, and everything in between, right? So Bible, Talmud, talking about, let's say, the year 70 to the year 200, something like that. Sorry, that's for the Mishnah, right? The Talmud then takes you to the 7th century, let's say, 6th, 7th century, the 500s, the 600s. And then everything from then on, from after the Talmud and sometime in the 6th, 7th century until today, okay? And those periods are divided up by different scholars in different ways. There's the medieval period, people called the Rishonim, the early commentaries, the early authorities. Then about, let's say, the late 16th century, we switch into the Acharonim, the later ones, and then up until today, okay? So that's the broad periodization. Bible, before the year 0 of the calendar we Americans follow. Talmud, up until about the 600s or so, and then later commentaries, okay? But what I do want to mention, and I think what makes these texts both so interesting and so challenging, and in a lot of ways so foreign, is that they are legal texts. They're not narrative texts by and large. They're texts that are about law, and in many cases, they're texts that were intended by their authors to only be read primarily by other experts, right? It's never clear that the Talmud ever intended someone who wasn't already immersed in Talmudic learning to read it, right? It's not clear that many of these interpretations of the early experts from the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century were ever intended to be read outside of their immediate context, okay? Outside of their rabbinic expert context, right? It's like Supreme Court decisions. Supreme Court decisions aren't necessarily meant to be read by non-experts. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, right? And so too, that's what we're facing here. But the foreignness, the legalistic nature of these texts, I think is what makes them also so interesting. Because legal texts are about, I have a situation, I have a circumstance, sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implicit, and the question then is, how do I respond to it? What should be the major response to that circumstance? Sometimes there's a single voice, sometimes there's multiple voices, right? Different kinds of responses. But the point is that when you're reading legal texts, and I understand that they feel weird and foreign and difficult at the beginning, is to put yourself in that mindset. The mindset of asking, what's the situation? What's the scenario? What's the case for people who have been in law school? What's the case? And what's the response? What's the law? What is this text telling me I am supposed to do in response to that circumstance? That's what you want to be doing for each of these texts. And then the way they interact with each other is that each of these texts is giving you a new idea, a new way to respond, either to that same situation or to a slight modification of that situation. So when you're reading these legalistic texts, you always want to ask yourself, is this talking about the same thing as that first text that I figured out what it was talking about? Or is it putting a twist on it? Is it saying something different? Is it saying, well, right, now we're adding an element to the case that is going to change the way we want to rule on that case, okay? So like I said, these texts are weird and foreign and difficult, but I also think that I know that they are the source of Jewish wisdom. And so we're going to work on them. We're going to work on them together. And the methodology, the primary methodology we're going to use to work on them is chevruta. Okay? So now I want to shift to talking about chevruta. So like I said, I gave you the analogy of driving the car before. So hopefully most of the folks in this room have now experienced at least what it's like to be behind the wheel. And maybe you didn't have full control over your chevruta vehicle last time. So let me give you a couple of ideas, a couple of tips. So the first thing is you have in front of you a sheet on chevruta tips by Rabbi David Levenkrus, who was a long-time beloved faculty member of Pardes. And you can read through it. I don't have to read it for you. You can read it yourselves. But I want to give you some broad guidelines for chevruta to sort of frame what it is we're doing. So what are we doing in chevruta? So chevruta is two people, ideally, sometimes three, but it's better if you can keep it one-on-one. That way someone has to talk all the time. The first thing you're doing is you're reading the text. Just reading it. As you read it, whether you're reading it in the original Hebrew or Aramaic, or if you're reading it in the English translation that I've provided, you're going to come up with questions about what this text means. What is it saying? It's very common, for example, for rabbinic texts to leave out a crucial word. Must I do this, or may I do this? In fancy grammar, that's called the modal verb, the helping verb, right? So it'll say, here's what you should do. And the question is, what does that mean? Am I required to do it? Is it an option? Okay? The force of these legal texts is often unclear from the text themselves. So one question you might want to ask yourself is, wait a minute, is this a requirement? Is this an absolute requirement? Or is this simply an option that they're giving me? If it's a requirement, why is it required? If it's an option, what are the other options? Right? So those are some of the questions that you want to be asking as you're reading through these texts. Once you feel like you have a handle on what the text is saying, what's the case? What's the circumstance? What's the situation it's addressing? And then, what's the response? And then, is the response a required response or an optional response? Then you ask the fun question, which is, why? Why is this telling me to do this? Or why is this recommending that I do this? Okay? And the why question often is either not spelled out at all, or sometimes is spelled out but underspecified. You're sort of like, that reason doesn't fully satisfy, and then you want to ask yourself, what are they trying to say? They've said something, but what is it they were really trying to say? And that's where the fun of chevruta is. The fun of chevruta is helping each other clarify what the text is saying, and then arguing about why the text is saying what it's saying. Arguing, because you know what? These texts are multivocal, and open to lots of different interpretation. And the beauty and importance of chevruta is that because each person is bringing different life experiences, different personality types, different insights to the texts, you are almost certainly at some point going to disagree with the other person about why the text is saying what it's saying. You should figure out together what the text is saying. Sometimes can be a dispute about that, but more importantly, why the text is saying what it's saying. And on the source sheets, I've given you some suggested questions, some guiding questions for most of the text, but don't limit yourself to that. Whatever comes up in your chevruta, argue it out, talk about it. What chevruta is not, and I think this is very important, chevruta is not about convincing each other that your read is right and the other person's read is wrong. That's not what chevruta is. Chevruta is not about shaming or berating the other person into agreeing with you. Chevruta is about, you've given an interpretation to this text. I've given a different interpretation to this text. Why are we disagreeing? What is the point of disagreement that we're having? Is it a linguistic point? Is it a content point? Is it a moral point? The point of chevruta is to figure out what it is you're disagreeing about fundamentally, and to understand why you're disagreeing about it without necessarily agreeing at the end of the day with the other person, without necessarily giving up on your position or convincing the other person to take your position. Okay, chevruta is a dialogic process, right? It's about dialogue. It's about talking it through. It's not about beating someone else up or convincing them in that way. Now, sometimes the other person will give such a good counter argument that you're like, oh yeah, you're right, my read doesn't work. That's fine. That's good. But that's not the point. The point is to argue. The point is to discuss. Sometimes you'll convince, but the point is not to try to convince. The point is to try to understand. Okay? That's really what we're trying to do in chevruta. And like I said, back to the car example one last time, if I've not beaten this one to death, right? You'll figure out over time how chevruta works. You'll figure out how this car of your chevruta works. You'll figure out what the right speed to take the turns at is, how much to turn the wheel. To translate that to chevruta, you'll figure out at what point do you say, I get what you're saying, I get what you're saying, we're disagreeing, let's move on. And at what point do you say, actually, I want to push a little harder, right? You'll feel it out, okay? The last piece I want to talk about is pacing. Some people, maybe all of us, could spend the entire time on one text. These are very rich, very interesting texts, but I want to encourage us to move. I want to encourage us to be able to get through some material so we can have a richer discussion at the end. So how is that going to work for this? The way that's going to work for this is that there are two sections of tonight's source sheet. Section 1 are preliminary sources on the idea of what's the limit to how much I need to spend on mitzvot. How much money do I need to spend on mitzvot? Okay, that's section 1. Those are your preparatory texts. Those are the texts to get you into the conversation that the texts in section 2 are going to use to discuss the questions they were asked, okay? So the texts in section 1 are Talmud and commentaries. The texts in section 2 are responsa, real questions asked by real people to real rabbinic authorities who are giving real answers, okay? And you'll see if you look at the dates on the text in section 2 that these are 20th century, very, very contemporary questions being asked to very, very contemporary authorities, okay? Okay. I'm going to pause here, actually. I have one more thing I want to say to introduce tonight, and then I'm going to let you loose on chevruta. But I want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions or concerns. So just raise your hand, ask it, and David and Peter will relay it to me if I can't hear it. Okay, great. I can only see a subsection, so I'm relying on David and Peter here to read the room, as it were. Okay, great. So let me frame tonight's session, okay? So for folks who were here 2 weeks ago, we talked about as I mentioned at the beginning, interpersonal responsibility in a global age, which basically means what is the extent of my responsibility to help someone who is in mortal danger, okay? Someone who is in mortal danger. And we looked at a couple of interpretations of that scenario, and we saw, number one, that the mortal danger that the other person is facing need not be obvious, but can be doubtful, right? I see someone who's walking under a piano, right? To take the classic cartoon example, I see someone walking under a piano, right? And I don't know if the piano is going to drop or not, but I have a responsibility to be paying attention and be ready to whisk them out of the way in case the piano does drop, okay? I can't just turn my back and say, everything's going to be fine, okay? So the first one was, we have a responsibility, according to rabbinic texts, to be aware and helpful to people, even if the danger is not certain, but is plausible, okay? That's one thing we talked about. The second thing that we talked about in terms of interpreting the scope of our interpersonal responsibility is the question of danger for myself. How much danger do I need to put myself in to save someone else, right? I see someone being pulled away by a riptide. I'm an okay swimmer. I'm actually a terrible swimmer, but let's say that I was an okay swimmer, right? But I'm not sure, right? Maybe I'll get trapped by the riptide also, right? And there's a debate about how far we need to endanger ourselves, if at all. And we're going to talk about that more actually 2 weeks from tonight when I'm back in Pittsburgh in person, which I look forward to, about put my life versus your life. Okay, we're going to look at that question more in depth. So I want to put that debate aside. The third thing we looked at was the extent of my responsibility to pay money to save you. Okay? The Talmud said, not only am I responsible to save someone by using my body to save them, but if I can't use my body, or I don't want to use my body, or I'm afraid that if using my body I'm not going to succeed, I can't just say, well, I'm done. So much for that, right? But actually what I need to do is find someone who can help and pay them if necessary. And it's that last clause, pay them if necessary, that leads us into tonight's topic, which is, what are the limits of pay them if necessary? Okay? Everyone basically agrees that I can recover my costs from the person I saved, presuming they haven't, right? I'm allowed to ask them to repay me what I paid to help save them, and presumably if they say, thank you for saving me, but no, I'm not going to pay you, I can take them to court to recover those wages, okay? Basically, that's agreed upon by all rabbinic commentators. But the question becomes, what if there's not the possibility of repayment? What if there's not the possibility of recovering that money? Am I then required still? And how much am I required to spend in order to save? Okay? And I'm going to put the big question out there right up front. I know that there are people in the United States of America who are dying for lack of health care. Am I required to pay for their health care? And that question, it's a live one. It's a real big live question, right? That question is exactly the question that was posed to these two 20th century rabbinic commentators, rabbinic authorities of the land of Israel, which you should know has a socialized healthcare system. Not quite single payer, it's a little more complicated, but they have a nationalized healthcare system in the state of Israel. Okay, everyone basically pays something to help other people get healthcare. That's the way it works. And everyone's required to pay in. The question asked to these rabbinic authorities in the land of Israel was, what's my financial responsibility in those circumstances? What's my responsibility for financial outlay? And I think, at least I found their responses surprising. I found them to be very surprising and very challenging. And I'm not going to say more than that because I don't want to spoil it for you. So again, what you have in front of you is a source sheet with two sections. The first section are classic sources about what are the limits of my responsibility to pay money to perform mitzvot, okay? In that section, you'll see, are there distinctions between different kinds of mitzvot, right? Am I allowed to voluntarily pay more? Okay, that's the sorts of questions for that section. And I would say in terms of pacing, you should spend probably about a half hour at most on those sources. You don't have to rush through them, but you should move through them, get the basic ideas, and then spend the bulk of your chevruta time, which I'm going to say we should do until about 9:10, 9:15, okay? The bulk of your chevruta time spend on the responsa in section 2, okay? Tonight, because of the geographical distance and the challenge of the technology, tonight, most of this is about you and your learning. I'm giving you this introduction, and then I'm going to do a concluding kind of frontal conclusion around 9:10, 9:15. We'll try to leave time for some questions. We won't be able to do the back and forth, I think, as we normally do it when I'm there in person, but it's an experiment, and we'll constantly be reevaluating. So thank you for coming. I'm very excited to try this new model of this distance Beit Midrash model, distance for me and personal for you. So I'm here. I'm with you. If you have any questions, you can come up to the iPad, and you can either speak your question, and I'll respond, or you can type it in, and David will show you where there's a little chat screen. I'll try to pull it up. Maybe do you see it? Yes? Okay. And David will show you how to type it in. Okay? Any questions? Any concerns? Everyone ready? Okay. I'm going to say find a person to learn with and take your source sheet and start learning. Go to it.
We were just saying we know each other. Maybe it'd be better for us to like mix it up. Yeah. I need to leave at 9 o'clock. Anybody wants to do like myself or with Rita? Yeah. You want to come with me? Okay. It just seems silly for me to, I know her. So that's fine. It was very lovely. I mean, about like, I knew you like 100 years ago. I had your kids a long time ago, and I worked with the after-school program here. Oh, so yeah, like 20 years ago. I think you should. Yeah, I mean,
Okay. So, were you here for last one? I was not either. So this really will be the blind leading the blind. Yeah, sure. Okay. Great.
That in fact, what we see when we look at those responsa is they don't quote the Aruch HaShulchan explicitly, even as they seem to adopt his idea. And what we see if we look at the first source, the Minchat Shlomo, or Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, great rabbinic sage of Jerusalem in the early and middle 20th century, is that he says, when confronted with the question of how much do I have to spend to save a sick person's life, his answer is basically fundamentally everything. Right? He says at the end of the day, what you should be spending is everything. And how does he transcend the 1/5 limit? He says, It's not a positive commandment where there's a limit. It's a negative commandment. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. Make sure that your fellow does not die. How could you hold yourself back financially in a circumstance where your fellow is about to die? That's his fundamental approach. And if you got to source number 8, that's basically the approach of Rav Eliezer Waldenberg also. And something interesting you should know about Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, and I kind of kept this in my pocket to reveal it now, is that he was the rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem. He is famous for writing hundreds of responsa on medical issues. So when he's asked, how much do I have to spend in order to save sick people whose lives are in danger? He's not thinking about this case theoretically. He's thinking about all of those dying patients that he saw every single day. And he does a fascinating thing in his tshuva, in his responsa. He says, there is a position out there, I gave it to you on the source sheet 2 weeks ago, you can download it, of the Yad Ramah, Reb Meir Levi Abulafia, who said, yeah, if the person can't repay you, you don't maybe have an obligation to save them, at least not to spend your money to save them. And then what does the Tzitz Eliezer do? What does Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg do? He brings source after source after source that destroys that idea, that thinks it's horrific, that can't even imagine how someone could say such a terrible thing. In other words, he basically says that idea that maybe, right, and there's good reason to say, well, if I'm not going to get repaid, then I'm probably not going to save the person anyway, so maybe we shouldn't put a requirement on people that they can't live up to. He just thinks that's terrible. He thinks it's horrible, it's horrific. He can't stomach it, and he just destroys it. Now, what's interesting is that he also doesn't tell you what the limit is, which implies very strongly that he thinks there's no financial limit. You need to spend whatever you need to spend to save a sick person. That's it. End of the line. Go back to the Minchat Shlomo for a second, though, source number 7, because he raises an interesting possibility that he seems both uncomfortable with but willing to entertain. And that's the following problem, which is we've been spending all this time talking about our obligation to the other, our obligation to save the endangered other, and the fact that in our contemporary world, we know so many endangered others that if the requirement were truly that we had to spend all of our money every time we encountered an endangered other who could not save themselves and from whom we could not recoup our costs, then we would go bankrupt in about 3 seconds. Maybe 4, depending on how long the PayPal account took to go through, right? That's the reality of it. And so the Minchat Shlomo says, well, hold on a second. Maybe we actually don't have an individual responsibility to spend all of our money, but we have a collective responsibility. Now, collective responsibilities are very challenging because how do I know that I'm calculating my share correctly? And that's why I think the Minchat Shlomo, if you read the response very, very carefully, he both thinks this is a reasonable idea, but is very, very troubled by it. And I think he's troubled by it because of the fact that it's very difficult for us to honestly assess what is our appropriate contribution. And here I think we have to go back to the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud said you don't spend more than 1/5 of your resources on a mitzvah. Why? Lest you yourself become impoverished. In other words, you would defeat the whole purpose of having a financial limit, right? If you become impoverished, then you just shift the obligation to someone else to give the money back to you, right? And I think that's a little bit what he's getting at here. I think what he's getting at here is it's unreasonable to say that there is no limit for any individual, because then we would just have people constantly shifting their money around. I spend all my money to save that person, then that person gets better, and then I get sick, and that person has to spend all their money to save me, right? And the money just keeps getting shifted back and forth, right? I think what he's thinking is, well, it's actually very important to have reasonable financial limits to mitzvot like this, particularly in an age when we are well aware of more sick people that need financial help than any one individual could ever help or support. And at the same time, he wants to preserve a sense that But fundamentally, every single individual has that obligation to save sick people, even at the cost of all of their money. So if I'm going to sort of translate this, into some of our contemporary debates and conversation around healthcare and our obligation for healthcare, I think these sources can start to help us shift that conversation, right? Because especially this source, the Minchat Shlomo, who says there's obviously a collective obligation, and more than that, there's obviously a collective obligation that we should impoverish ourselves a little bit collectively in order to make sure that people aren't dying. That we need to be doing everything possible financially in order to save every person that we can possibly save, and that we shouldn't be thinking about that in a miserly way. We shouldn't be thinking about that in a way that says, well, right, 1/5, right, oh, okay, we put these almost arbitrary limits, right? Nor can we bankrupt ourselves as a society. Just as an individual can't bankrupt themselves, so too he would probably have to agree that a society can't bankrupt itself. Simultaneously, he wants to maintain the idea that fundamentally, what does a society where people support each other really mean? It means that we're willing to go all the way, certainly with our money. We'll talk about bodies next time, but certainly with our money, we're required to go all the way to make sure that people aren't dying, to save everyone we can possibly save. And I think that shifts the focus of the conversation a little bit away from just the financial aspect, but also to that fundamental moral and interpersonal aspect. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. Do not let your brother die. How could you do that? How could you let them die? And I think once we shift to that sense where we have deep interpersonal responsibility, then the conversations around what's financially feasible become a lot less miserly and a lot more generous. That's one way that we can put these sources together. I'm more than happy to take any comments that folks have. And I also want to say that I look forward to learning with you in 2 weeks in person. So let the questions come.
Oh, okay. Hi. So my question is about the cost to save people. We know, I'm sure in Israel is, well, no, you're in America anyway. So, in America, okay, at end of life care, most of health, the expenses for healthcare come at the end of life. So how much as a society, are we obligated to save someone's life if we know we're saving their life, but they're only going to be living another month, 2 months, 3 months? Shouldn't we prioritize our resources in a certain way that, yes, we can save their life, but it's not going to be a permanent thing or a lasting thing?
Great. Good question. I'll take a couple more if there are any others.
I don't know if the concept of socialism existed back when these rabbis wrote, but
in the 20th century, I think it did.
Okay. Well, some of the early ones, but would this be an endorsement of socialism and one-payer system for medicine? Good question. Any others? Yeah.
This might be too basic. Where's the microphone?
Right there. I hear you perfectly.
Good. This might be too basic, but the very first Mishnah, the source 1, it says there's no limit to these things, but all the things they mention have limits. There's only but so much of the corners, because if there's no limit to that, then there's no field left.
Very nice.
There's only so many first fruits.
Great.
After that, there's the second fruits. There's only so many sacrifices you can bring. You have no more flock. So it just seems, I'm confused even at the very start. It seems to imply that there is actually a limit to acts of loving kindness, just like the other one.
Great. So, tremendous. Okay, good. So let me answer those 3 questions, because I know it's 9:30 and folks do want to go. So let me start. I'll start at the end, which is against the way that the Mishnah says I should start, but I'll start at the end. That is a tremendously fascinating reading of that Mishnah that I had never thought of or considered. But you're obviously right. And you're even more right than you probably think you are, which is that the Mishnah says, if I leave my entire field as the corner of the field, right? In other words, I say, yep, the poor can just come in and take all of my crop, then I actually haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. which is a fascinating idea, right? In other words, it needs to be about generosity and not total self-abnegation. And you're absolutely right about your observation about the flock running out and the first fruits running out, right? If I bring them all, then what do I have left? Yeah, so I think you're right. I think that's a great read of this Mishnah. When this Mishnah says there's no limit, it means, right, you can bring a lot, right? It doesn't mean there's really no limit, because obviously there's a physical limit. What's interesting then becomes about the loving kindness piece, which is, does it mean to imply also that loving kindness has a limit? In other words, eventually you become exhausted physically from running around to every Shiva house, right, in town, right? That in fact there is a natural human limit to it, right? Or does it maybe imagine loving kindness as sort of that one resource that is never truly exhausted? I don't know. I want to think about that a lot more, and thank you for that chidush. That's a beautiful novel read of the Mishnah. I hadn't thought of it. Yasher koach. Very, very good. Thank you. And I think you're right that it then can play into the way the rabbis read it as, well, since there's a natural limit, right, then if we impose a 1/5 limit, right, then maybe we're doing already what nature, we're just enhancing the limit of what nature already would impose. Very fascinating. Okay, good. So now I'll go back to the socialism question. So I mentioned at the beginning, right, that both of these rabbis are Israeli rabbis, and that Israel does have an essentially socialized medical system. It's not single payer. It's actually more complicated than that. They have different health, basically they have different health, what they call kupot, different health kind of I don't know how to translate kupot, but like different companies basically. But they're very highly regulated and everyone has to pay in and whatever. But I think you're right to note that these rabbis are already writing in a context of a more socialized medical system. And I think they are, in some sense, affirming that indeed our society does need to pay as much as it can possibly pay in order to save people's lives. So I think you're right. I think you're right that there is an assumption of a socialism here. There's an assumption, I think, also of an interpersonal responsibility, right? There's an assumption that this is a society where we're all Jews, even though we're not all Jews, right? Israel is 20% Arab, right? And by the way, the hospital that the Tzitz Eliezer worked in, Shari Tzedek, is very commonly used by Arab citizens of East Jerusalem. So he knew Arabs, and he knew, and he doesn't make explicit distinctions on the basis of ethnicity. I think he may have seen all of those people as linked in some way, and that we all have an interpersonal responsibility. I don't want to push that too far. I don't know for sure, but I think it's a possibility. So then to go back to the first question, right? I think that exactly hits on these questions of limits. Classical Jewish sources see every second of life as precious and don't make a ton of distinctions about quality of life, although there is one famous story in the Talmud where, I forget who it was, maybe it was Rabbi Yochanan, I'm not sure, don't quote me on that, who was dying. He was very old and dying, and the rabbis kept praying and praying and praying that he would stay alive, and indeed he stayed alive. And then his servants saw how much he was suffering because of those prayers, dropped a vase to distract the rabbis who were praying, apparently 24/7, they had a prayer chain going on, distracted them, and then that let him die, and that's seen as a positive thing. So that text is used a lot in end-of-life conversations in Jewish law of like, when can we what does it mean? What's our contemporary equivalent of removing the prayers, right? Of stopping the prayers. But I do think that the question of the economic question, the economic aspect of that, is indeed playing a role here. On the one hand. On the other hand, I think there is still a sense of lo tamad al dam re'echa, right? Don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, in its most expansive sense, says, who am I to judge that someone else's extra month of life isn't important? Now, maybe you want to say that's all well and good when getting them that extra month of life is going to bankrupt everyone else, right? The piece of that Babylonian Talmud that says we have to put a limit on mitzvot expenditures because we recognize that poverty is really bad, individual poverty is really bad, and obviously collective poverty would be even worse, right? So I think I'm hedging my bets here, right? Because I think what we're encountering, and this requires a lot more conversation, is how do I balance between those competing values? And that's, to sort of editorialize for a second, right? That's something that I'm continually pushing, right? Which is seeing law in general and Jewish law in specific as about how do we come up with societally reasonable and good and moral balances of competing values, right? It would be bad if we bankrupted ourselves, both individually and collectively. That would lead to horrible results. More people would die. On the other hand, if we don't push a little bit, then people are also going to die unnecessarily, right? If we're not spending as much as more than we think we can, but not so much that we destroy ourselves. And that's what I think these texts are trying to get at. I think they're trying to get at that very balance. These texts can't say exactly what the limit is, right? They can't say exactly what the limit of treatment, right, versus outlay of expenditure should be, right? That's what we have policy experts for. But what they can say is those are two competing values, and our responsibility is to be talking about how do we balance those responsibly, rather than saying, nope, we just can't afford it, sorry. Or I'm just going to do whatever it takes, no matter what the consequences are for me or my society. And these texts are exactly about how do I balance those two responsibly and not just pick one pole or the other pole. That's what I would say. All right. I want to thank you all. I want to thank you especially for those who were able to stay for staying. Thank you for this experiment. Thank you. We're going to keep working on it. Please fill out the survey that David and Peter are going to send out to you. And I look forward to seeing you in person in 2 weeks, where we're going to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Looks like